Hi, my name's Jim Bro, and I want to welcome you and gentlemen today. We're here at Linwood with Charles Allen, Bill Cushing, and Sid Cheney. They're veterans from World War II in various theaters of operation, and I guess all were in the Army Air Force back then, and they're just going to explain a little bit today about their adventures and their sagas. I guess we'll start there. Maybe if you want to just tell us, in order, what you did during the war, when you got started, when you were in the service. Start with Mr. Allen.
Okay, well, of course, everybody's excited for this 50th commemoration of the end of World War II, and I'm reminded of Longfellow's great poem, Paul Revere, that starts, it was back in 1775, there's hardly a man that's now alive, and I'm starting to think in those terms of 1945, and particularly as we see the revision of history that's taking place in some of the news media. But I was in the service for a little over 3.5 years, starting in 1942 in February, joining in 39 Whitehall Street in New York City in the Army Air Force, and getting out in November of 1945 with an awful lot of experience in between. And we can touch on those, but you want to go ahead.
Mr. Cushing?
I enlisted the 8th of December, the day after Pearl Harbor, 1941. I went in the Signal Corps because at that time I didn't know what I wanted. I just wanted to get in and do something. Later on I found out they were looking for gunners in the Air Force. I figured it was a lot better to fly than to walk. So I went to the Air Force. I took my training, my basic training started locally, really, down in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, then up here to Manchester, New Hampshire, then to Tyndallfield, Florida, Salt Lake City, Tucson, Pocatello, Idaho, and across the ocean. And that's when it started to get rough.
Now, you were in Italy? To what year?
I started, our original position started in Benghazi, Libya, with the 9th Air Force. There was 2 B-24 groups. That was it.
Wow.
And we moved from there up into Tunisia and then to southern Italy. Stayed there till the end of the war.
To the end. So you were basically in for all the American involvement. Okay. Mr. Cheney?
I volunteered, left college in Boston. I was going to Northeastern University.
You left college?
I got kind of low on funds, and I saw that pilot training was open to high school graduates. So they called me up April 4th, 1943.
43.
And I finished up in November 1945.
And you flew P-47s and P-51s in Europe?
No, I flew P-47s as a prelude to going overseas.
Oh, okay.
And ended up in P-51s.
Over in Europe?
Yes.
Maybe if we can talk about how many missions you each flew and maybe some of the more memorable things.
Got my training in the southeast part of the United States and a series of aircraft that we can go through later. And was sent to the Southwest Pacific area and arrived there in September of 1943. All the predestinations of management in war get thrown to the winds when you face the reality. And I was trained in a B-25 and flew it for a year overseas, but the exigencies then required the discontinuance of medium bombers in the Southwest Pacific, and we were given B-24s to fly. Now, normally you get 10 to 11 months training in each operational aircraft. We were presented with B-24s and told that we were run a mission 6 weeks later to Hollandia, New Guinea. And we were given no instructors. There were just one fellow. Our group commander was checked out. He checked out the squadron commanders. They checked out the operations officers, the flight leaders, and down the line. Through the grace of God, we lost no aircraft in that process. But we flew those for another year. And it ranged all over, starting in the Southwest Pacific from the southeastern end of New Guinea, pushed the enemy up along the coasts and into the Dutch East Indies, and it was one hell of a scrap all the way. And I flew out of the Dutch East Indies and then north to the Palau group. The specific island was Angao Island, a little tiny atoll in the South Pacific from which we staged missions to the southern Philippines and later to Manila. And then we moved up to the southern tip of Luzon, which is the large island that Manila's on, but this was the southern tip. It's 400 miles south of that. And we flew missions quite a distance all over the Philippines, and then finally moved up to Clark Field, which was the Air Force base most recently decommissioned, but was, I guess, 30, 40 years or longer, an Air Force base 60 miles north of Manila. And from there, we ran missions to what is now called Taiwan, which is then Formosa, Japanese, and also to China, to Amoy, Hong Kong, and one to Shanghai. And then, in the course of 2 years, the war was ended in Europe, and the great push was on to finish it off. And my group left and landed and set up a base in Okinawa, at which point it was determined that I was a shot load and sent me home, 67 missions in 403 hours. Wow. And the day that I came in a boat into the harbor near Long Beach, after 19 days at sea, zigzagging all over, avoiding submarines, as we came past Catalina Island, it came over the airwaves that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Japan. And a few days later, as I was in a steam train coming back near Atlanta, headed for New York, I heard the second bomb was dropped. And a few days later, it was all over. And that's a thumbnail.
Maybe you can talk about some of your missions.
Well, when we got over there, we were supposed to go to England, to the 8th Air Force. But it seems as though there was a shortage of bombers in the Middle East, around Libya. So we got sidetracked and wound up in Benghazi, Libya, which is the end of the world, really. After seeing England with green grass and everything, we got to Benghazi, Libya, and it was like a big beach. Nothing but sand. Nothing. And scorpions, Arabs, camels. We flew out of there. Our biggest problem was the sand, because you'd get dust storms, and of course the engines and the guns and everything on the planes are very sensitive. And the sand gets into them, and lots of times the plane would take off and have to turn around and come back. An engine would quit. Wow. The sand had got into it and ruined it.
If you got sand in your guns, could that cause them to explode on firing?
In the barrel, yes, it would, yeah. And of course you didn't want it in the firing mechanism either. And we flew out of there, of course I was kind of lucky. Our tent was about 100 yards from the Mediterranean Ocean, which made it good, because in the daytime, 110, 120 degrees and no shade. Then we'd go for a swim. When we went flying, go have target practice, just go lay on the beach or try to stay cool, that's all. During the day, it was brutally hot, and you'd freeze at night. It got so cold.
Wow.
Just the opposite of the daytime.
It's not a comfortable...
But we flew out over the Mediterranean to southern Italy, into Romania, Greece, and then the Italians surrendered. We chased the Germans out of Africa. They were up into Sicily and Italy, and we moved up into Tunisia, which was a little better. A little better. And then from there, when the Germans got pushed further north, we moved into, they called it sunny Italy. And I think we were there 6 months before we saw the sun. Mud, oh, it was horrible.
Southern Italy?
Southern Italy, yeah.
You thought it was getting better, and it was
We thought
just
it was
different.
getting better. And the one thing we discovered about Italy, which is not, I guess, a well-known fact around, but the sewerage system over there is not the best in the world. And you always knew there was a village nearby before you got there. You couldn't help but find it.
Tell me, were you landing on metal strips or what kind
In the
of...
desert, we had a blacktop strip in the desert. Up in Tunisia, it was gravel.
What about in Italy?
Italy, we had a blacktop strip because that was a former fighter base, German fighter base.
And it wasn't bombed out, right?
Well, it was bombed out, but I mean, they had repaired the runway before we got there. It was kind of short when we got there.
You know, it was terribly amazing to me. You know, we glorify ourselves, but when I think of some of the work done by organizations like the Corps of Army Engineers and the Seabees, we would move into an island in the South Pacific, or a part of New Guinea, which was a hardwood forest, mahogany, teak, and other exotic hardwoods. And in a matter of 4 or 5 weeks, they'd come in there with bulldozers and clear that thing out. 1.25 miles you needed.
Yeah.
It had tall trees at both ends. They clear out just enough, unfortunately, just enough,
Yeah.
and lay down one of these metal strips.
Yeah.
And when I say just enough, I mean with a fully loaded B-24, 8,000 pounds of bombs, and 1,800 gallons of gasoline and 11 people, and you go off
Yep.
the end of that thing and lift, and you just see that tree line there, and you pull your gear up, and you'd go literally right through the leaves
Sure.
there and go right
Yeah.
on out. But those fellas were
Yeah.
terrific, the way they could lay a strip down. And,
Well, they extended our runway in Italy with the metal strips.
yeah.
And it was kind of a nerve-wracking situation to be going down, you'd be on the blacktop, and all of a sudden you get this rattling underneath you. You kind of thought the plane was coming apart, and hoped it didn't, that's all.
Well, war is full of surprises, you know. I think every one of us here and throughout the world, when you are in the service, you expect to get shot at, you steel yourself, you get emotionally prepared for the war. So when it comes, it's no surprise. It's the surprises that get you. And our big surprises were the weather in the South Pacific. And we lost, I joined this organization, and as I told you, it was in 2 years. We lost 100% of our aircraft. That is, of 12 B-24s in that squadron, 12 of them had been wiped out when I left. 50% of them were the weather. I'll ask you to visualize the island of New Guinea, 1,500 miles long, with these spiny mountains on the south and also on the north, uncharted. The Australians had made magnificent charts for us of the seacoast. They were deadly accurate, but the elevations, you'd be flying along, and you'd look on the chart and say that mountain is 7,400 feet. You'd look at it, you're flying at 10,000 and you're looking up at it, you know? And so you'd go down the valley at night, or in the daytime, 800 miles, stretching the gas, accomplish the mission, and then head back home. The weather's now come in. You can't see anything, you're on instruments. The valley narrows as you go to the southeast, and for 5 hours you're flying down, and you're going to come into a place called Nadzab in Ley, New Guinea, with 18,000 footers on the south and 12,000 footers on the north side, and the valley there is about 12 miles wide. You've been flying now 4 hours, and you had no contact with the land. You don't know what the hell the wind direction is, and you're going to set down in there. And some did and some didn't. Wow. And that was always because the best of your ability and skills can't play against the roulette wheel because you don't know which way the wind is. So we lost a lot of airplanes that way, a lot of good people.
That can be as nerve-wracking as the mission itself.
More so, because you expect it on the mission.
Yeah.
You don't expect it.
Now you had a little bit different. You were flying fighters, which pretty much you're on your own. There's no crew. Maybe if you could talk about some of your adventures flying up there on missions and getting back by yourself.
Oh, well, we didn't go by ourselves.
Well,
We
within
went
the aircraft.
In formations. 3 squadrons in a fighter group. And whatever the target was it required a great many planes or not. Our group could put up 40 planes as a full amount.
For cover, did you do a lot of the escorts or varied?
That was mainly what it was.
So where were you based in Italy?
San Severo. You know where Foggia is?
Yeah?
Okay, we're about 15 miles north of Foggia.
Okay. Well, we were down in San Pancrazio, way down in the instep of Italy, down the lower end of the boot.
Now, how many missions did you fly?
I had 51, and they were not all the same. Mostly escort.
Yeah, we probably saw you once in a while.
To Bucharest, Ploesti.
Don't even talk about that one.
Yeah.
Bucharest was my first one.
That was a good one.
Not far from Ploesti.
No.
And we did a little ground firing too.
Strafing of targets?
Yeah. After we'd accompanied the bombers a certain length of time, there were, I think, 5 other fighter groups. And we had 10-minute intervals that each group would take up. 10 minutes into the target, there'd be 10 over another group and some coming out. and then we would go for targets of opportunity, and that could be most anything.
On the way back.
Yeah.
And that's when you had fun. You strafe trains or troop columns or anything.
Yes.
If they'd turn you loose.
That was when my squadron commander chewed me out.
What were you
I
doing?
broke formation when we were strafing an airfield, and I saw it would hang like that. I just headed for it, and the first thing I knew, it was all this ground fire going by. And that was the closest, I think,
Wow.
Guinea I came.
Now, as far as your accommodations, was your base as wonderful as the other two?
Well, it's like the old loggers up here.
It was like a logging camp?
Yeah.
Pretty real. You brought in some pictures, Mr. Allen, of some of the aircraft that you flew. Some of you might have had some of the same basic training aircraft. Maybe if you can just go through some of these,
Okay.
hold them up and...
I'd just like to interject something, though, that, you youngsters are going to be thinking about seeing the movies about love and passion and all the things that are coming in your life. I don't think there's any greater love than there is for a bomber pilot for seeing a fighter escort as he goes towards the target, and you're 800 miles from home and all by yourself, and here are these P-51s, and you know they're your friends, and they're going to guard you the best they can. And boy, they did a marvelous job. Where I was, we had the Marines giving us escort in F-4Us, P-51s, and the great P-38, the twin-engine Lightning made by Lockheed, which was one of the most beautiful things ever in the air. I got my training in the Southeast, and the first plane I ever flew was this one. I hope that'll show. It's got a covering on it, which is a Stearman Boeing PT-13A. I flew a PT-17A, which is the exact same thing, except had a Continental engine, whereas this one has a Lycoming. It was made to take abuse, because I can tell you students gave great abuse to airplanes when they're supposed to come in and land.
Which one did they call the vibrator?
Yeah, it's coming up. You level off to land, and sometimes you think you're right on the ground and you're 20 feet in the air. Well, this landing gear was made to take it, and it did.
Student pilots still do a lot of damage to planes.
The next one we flew was to learn how to fly instruments, was made by the Vultee Aircraft Company in Texas, affectionately known as the Vultee Vibrator, BT-13A.
You fly
that too?
And that was a very, very good plane. It was a very sturdy plane, and it was forgiving. And we learned how to fly at night on that airplane. It had basic instruments in it. Then you were asked, in most cases, whether you wanted to go into twin-engine training in advanced or single-engine training, and I elected for twin and was lucky enough to get it. You didn't always get what you asked for. And I got trained on two planes. One was the Beech AT-10, which I believe is the first airplane ever constructed in this country out of pressed plywood. And it had two Jacobs 330 horsepower engines in it. That BT-13 had a 450 Pratt & Whitney. And this airplane was an excellent trainer for the C-47 or the DC-3, as it was known in civilian there, which is a transport. This airplane, the Curtiss AT-9, was all metal, twin engine with two Jacobs in it, which was a specific trainer for a high wing loading B-26s and B-25s. And these planes came in at very high speed to land. They didn't have very much wing because you wanted speed rather than lifting capacity. And you landed them in a quite different way. You brought them in very fast and cut the throttles, and you better be on the ground. And this airplane simulated all those characteristics and was an excellent trainer for it. Somewhere along the way, I did learn how to fly a C-47, which is like a great workhorse of the world, built by Boeing. Operationally, I was trained in the North American Mitchell B-25.
Now, you had a rather interesting story about your first
if you want, it takes a minute or two to tell you. I got trained in this airplane in Greenville, South Carolina for February through June, 4 or 5 months, 1943, and picked a brand new one up at Hunter Field, Savannah, Georgia, with sealed orders to deliver it to Amberley Field, Ipswich, Brisbane, Australia. which was an interesting concept since the biggest water I had ever flown over was the Mississippi River at that point. So we took off from Savannah and headed out to Hamilton Field on the West Coast, and we made a stop in Texas, which I've forgotten where we were headed to. We were headed probably to Phoenix, but we had a little trouble over Midland, Texas. We couldn't get our landing gear down, and when we finally cranked it down by hand and landed there, it was apprehended there were iron filings in the hydraulic cylinders, and nobody could figure out how in the world they would get there. But they took them out, fixed it up, and we flew it to the West Coast, reported to Hamilton Field, and instinct told me to maybe have our parachutes checked. So we sent them to the parachute loft that night, and we came back the next morning to find our airplane and the whole area surrounded by the FBI, military police, and they collared us and started asking all kinds of questions. It appeared that each one of our parachutes had been packed specifically so that it would not open. It had been rigged so that they would fail to open. And make a long story short, we were there 6 weeks before we went overseas while they checked this all out, which was great for us every night in San Francisco. It was wonderful. And it determined that it had been the sabotage had taken place at the North American plant in Kansas City. And they fixed our airplane up, and off we went and flew that baby. First flight was to Hawaii, which is nothing today. You can fly it from New York nonstop. But in those days, that was quite a flight. It was 11 hours. They took out this top turret and put a special gas tank in there, made a special insert tank in the bomb bay. It was this carried 103 extra gallons, and we put 480 gallons more in the bomb bay tank. And when we landed at Hickam Field that morning, they put a stick in the gas tank, and they figured we had 20 minutes gas left.
Wow.
And we went south then we stayed there 10 days while they took the airplane, put all the armor plate back at the pilot, and put the gas tanks out and put the machine guns all back in, which had been removed and sent over by boat. They gave us 10 days in Hawaii, which was great. And south we went to Christmas Island, which is due south of Hawaii, 1,500 miles. Then on to Pago Pago in the American Samoas, and from there to Nandi in the Fiji Islands, and from there to Plain de Gai, New Caledonia, and from there to Brisbane, Australia, and where we were thrown into a pool, and 3 weeks later assigned to my squadron, which went on up to New Guinea. And unfortunately, as we came into the squadron in the bus that morning, there was a smoking wreckage of a B-25, and we found out one of our colleagues from Greenville had augured in the night before. There was a malfunction of the automatic pilot, and they took off and just rolled over and killed everybody. But we went on through training there and up to New Guinea across the Gulf of Carpentaria. And New Guinea we flew in for 1 year. And then we, as I told you earlier, were given these B-24s at Port Moresby, New Guinea, and given 6 weeks to learn how to fly them, which we did, and then flew them in for another year. It was an amazing airplane. It had this Davis wing with a special airfoil, which gave it tremendous lifting capacities, and it carried 8,000 pounds of bombs and a full load of gasoline, which I believe was 1,800 gallons. And experimentally, we found you could put 2 more 1,000-pound bombs, hanging them in between the inboard nacelles and the fuselage. So we actually took off sometimes with 10 1,000-pounders, and it didn't really affect the flying characteristics. The airplane was amazing, and a very beautiful one on instruments, and we could fly long. I had one in the air for 18 hours once, and that's a long time.
It's a long flight.
It was a long flight. In those days, I used to smoke. I quit cold, thank God, in 1947, but you couldn't see out of the airplane coming home with a cigar smoke. But maybe I've talked too much. No. Go ahead.
Hey.
I was just wondering, with the P-51, it was a longer range fighter, but 18 hours was definitely out of its realm, I would presume. What were some of the longer missions that you flew like?
Well, about 600 miles from our base, which would be 1,200 round trip.
1,200 miles?
That was the furthest for us within South Pacific, where they had 110-gallon tanks under each wing. We could stretch out to 2,400, I think.
Wow. That could make for a long mission. Now, when you're coming back from your mission, as when you went over, you don't necessarily have a lot of room left over for miscalculations of fuel. Did you ever get in situations where you were running a little low?
Yes, once. But fortunately, I was on the ground and it ran out of gas before I got to the packing stand.
That's close.
That's pretty close. Pretty close.
Now, on the B-24 as a gunner, they had, because of all the weight and everything, you had a limited amount of ammunition that you could carry. How long could you actually fire for?
Well, you're supposed to have a limited amount, but we always snuck a couple extra boxes on board because what they gave you, a new gunner just going into combat, you see a plane coming at you, you just squeeze that trigger. You'd probably empty that whole box.
Wow.
But of course, you'd also burn the barrel out too. So after a while, it was just, they taught us, which didn't make much sense afterwards, just 5 at a time, just boom, 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 try to keep it going for 5 shots. Well, when you got a guy coming at you and there's 6 machine guns aimed right between your eyes, you want to get him instead of him getting you. Of course, he's not aiming at you, but you think he is.
Yeah, it looks real close.
It looks pretty close, and what's he mad at me for?
Yeah.
So you just keep shooting. And lots of times you'd empty that 3 boxes they'd give us right out. Well, we used them, see, the fellows on my crew, we'd sometimes carry as many as 6 boxes per gun.
Wow.
Although we weren't supposed to, but nobody's looking, and it would go
to
get it in there because you needed it.
I've kind of forgotten, how long could you hold the trigger down without the gun overheating?
About 50 rounds. That would be it.
Yeah.
That is on the ground. Now, up there, at 60 below zero,
Yeah.
it would last a little longer.
You wouldn't regard this too humorously, but it is a kind of bittersweet humor. The war has its various effects on people. And we had one young fellow who was sent home in Section 8, psychologically unfit. And whether he was faking or whether it was for real, I don't know. But he was a gunner, and he was a front turret gunner in a B-24. And one day they had him flying with me. And we were going west over northwest Guinea, and we had P-47 escort. And all of a sudden, this guy's cutting loose, and my God, I couldn't see fighters anywhere, and I realized he was shooting at a P-47, one of ours. And of course, we collared him and grabbed him and tied him up and sent him home. But it was a little frightening there.
Yeah, that'll get your attention on both sides.
Yeah.
Well, also, there are fellows that, they'll fly, and they'll come back, and you go to the debriefing section to tell, what you saw, what happened, and they'll ask him a question, he'll just sit there and stare right ahead. There was one fellow on our crew that they sent home for the same thing.
Really?
After the 5th mission. He just wouldn't talk. He'd just sit there.
And you all had pretty long stays,
Oh,
all
yeah, they
over
were-
50 missions.
Well, I only had 37. I quit at 36.
Yeah.
Well,
Back in December of 43, the 28th of December, my group went to a target in northern Italy. We had been there the day before. No anti-aircraft, no fighters, but it was cloudy and we did a lousy job on the bombing, so we had to go back. I didn't go. I had a cold and they wouldn't let me fly because we didn't have pressurized cabins. My squadron sent out 7 planes and not a one came back.
Wow.
And there was a young fellow that took my place that day. He had his time in. I have no idea what happened to him. The only thing I know that my pilot, navigator, and bombardier, they were able to get out. And I saw a picture of them some months later in a captured German magazine that was taken when they were captured. And the odd part is our squadron insignia was a skull and crossbones. Well, it was on their flight jacket. And the title under the picture in German, it was Roosevelt's Butchers.
Nice.
Just our squadron insignia, that's all. We didn't have any, ulterior motive for it.
Yeah.
And after that, I refused to fly because I'd trained with those fellas for a year and flown with them. And it's like family.
I imagine it gets really close.
And I stayed around for a while, and then a couple of other missions come up, and I decided to try it. And I just couldn't take it anymore. I went up to Anzio, which was shortly after they went in there on the beachhead. And when I come back and sat down, I was shaking like a leaf, and I said, that's it, no more.
You know, we're celebrating this 50th anniversary, and there's no question that these gentlemen and I, the war is probably the major impact of anything in our lives. You can't help but think about it. I wake up sometimes in the night dreaming, and you think about the flying and the excitement, and probably the juxtaposition of tremendous excitement and the shooting of adrenaline into your system and flying your airplane, navigating it, commanding the people in the plane, and as you were over as long as I am, you can't help having greater command. I was squadron operations officer. And then you come back to complete ennui. You sit on the ground for great lengths of time with absolutely nothing to do, and to adjust to that was tremendous. I just want to say to you young people that, you know, with all of this excitement and interest, war is a very inglorious thing. It is a manifestation of man's inability to solve his problems in any other way. That war was pretty clear-cut. The forces of messianic evil were very evident, as is not the case in some of our recent conflicts. And if there's any way of avoiding it, you want to avoid it. Seeing your friends killed is no fun. I went over with the crew that I told you about. There were 6 of us, and only I came back. One by one, they were decimated. And they were all wonderful young people. And I had the problem, not problem, but the duty to communicate with their families afterwards, which I did. And it's a terrible, terrible experience. It's a wild experience, and it can't help but affect you.
What was it like coming back to the United States after being...
To me, that was a tremendous... This is my own personal failing. I had a hell of a terrible time adjusting, basically, for the reasons I gave, the juxtaposition of frantic activity and concentration and focus, and then nothing. And coming back, I wasn't trained in anything. I ended up doing other things, but I started off as a bank clerk, which I didn't like very, very much. I just finished 30 years as Vice President of Sales Administration of the American Broadcasting Company, but there was 50 years in between. And that was a very difficult time for me, 1945. I went back to Lehigh University, which was very good, but it was very difficult for me, that adjustment.
How about you two? What was it like coming back to the United States after the war?
Oh, it's all right, except like what he said. I had been in school when I volunteered for service and went through until it was over with. And I came back to school and I couldn't make it. I just went to pieces and went home.
And how about you?
Well, I was out of high school. I got out of high school in June, and I had a job. December 7th happened. I went and enlisted the next day. And when the war was over, I came back. They told us, oh, you get your job back. Well, I went back over where I'd worked, and it seems as though the man that was a foreman when I was there was still there. He was a German. His name was Emil Kleiner. And I remember we were talking one night before I left, and somebody asked him, they says, what if Germany ever declares war on us, Emil? He says, I go back and fight for the fatherland. Well, he was still there. Needless to say, I didn't want to go back to that place because I was afraid of what I'd do. But I calmed down after a while. I don't know how many jobs I had before I finally settled down. I got married. The war ended on the 8th of May in '45, and I married my high school girlfriend, the 11th. And as of last week, we were married 50 years.
Wow, congratulations.
It's been a long time. So things quieted down after that, and I settled down. We raised a family, and 2 of them graduated right here from Linwood.
Oh, wow.
So one in '76 and the other in '77. My youngest boy, I lost my oldest boy 4.5 years ago. My youngest boy, he's in the Air Force.
Oh, really?
Fireman, 14 years, stationed in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He's going to stay. He's following his old man, I guess.
Yeah. Maybe if we have some questions from some of the students, now we can go to that.
What were your lives like when you were growing up and being little?
Growing up,
Yeah. What was it like growing up in that time period?
well, things were a lot different than they are today. We didn't have television. Well, I can remember a radio my dad had. There was earphones went with it. And we'd sit around with the earphones on, listen to the radio at night. Or you'd read.
One of the great things was the era of the big bands.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody was always knowing exactly where Kay Kaiser and the College of Musical
Glenn Miller.
Knowledge and Glenn Miller and Frankie Carl were playing. And it's a great shame that some of those things have gone by the wayside. The unions killed them.
Yeah.
But growing up was different. We didn't have the travel that you have today. Remember, it was in 1948, I guess, the TWA changed its name from Transcontinental and Western Air to Trans World Airlines. Everything was done by... I even came home from the war on a steam train from Slough. But in the next 2 or 3 years, train travel just kind of died and air travel took over. And when air travel took over, people like you and me were able to go from place to place very, very quickly. And we learned about other cultures more quickly. And they came into our country and infiltrated here. So the point is that it was slower but more contemplative way of living than we have today.
Morgan?
When you were little, did you expect to go into the Air Force or Army?
I had always loved airplanes. My daddy was an entrepreneurial person in the early automotive industry. In fact, he hired a guy who became famous as a racing driver. My dad manufactured cars, Alan Kingston. And he hired Eddie Rickenbacker, who became the World War I ace. And I was fascinated by airplanes. And I would go over to what was then Roosevelt Field and saw some of those folks that attempted to cross the Atlantic, many of whom failed and got killed. But I never saw Lindbergh. But I think of Barbara Grayson and Amy Mollison and the Italian fellow, I can't remember his name, who crashed on takeoff and who put my brother in his cockpit beforehand. And therefore, when the war came, I think it was inevitable in the subconscious of everybody that we would be in that war after 1939, because we were supplying the stuff to Germany and to England and to Russia and France, and we were the arsenal of democracy. And I think I read in Time magazine that we sent over 2,500 first-line aircraft to Russia during the war, and I think 10 or 15,000 tanks. And you can't do this and not know that you're going to get involved. So when the war came, you know, I was working in a bank, and we were all incensed at what happened at Pearl Harbor, and here was a chance to fly and get the finest training. Even today, the best flight training is in the military. The airlines take their pilots they want them to go through the military school. You and I are paying for the training of those pilots. And that's really, I guess, how I started. But
how about you two? What made you go into the service? I'm presuming yours was pretty much a reaction to Pearl Harbor.
Prior to World War II, they had a program, they called it Citizens Military Training. You went for 4 years, 1 month at a time, usually the month of July. And you had to sign up for it, and you got paid, just like the Army did, $21 a day, once a month, and that was it. And I took my training down at Fort Adams, Rhode Island, which no longer exists now. It's a tourist attraction, I guess. And so I had 2 years of that, and then when Pearl Harbor came, I says, well, I got part of it. I guess I got to end the war.
Yeah.
But it took a long while after I got in from to end it, so I wasn't the one that won the war after all. I wanted to be, but I wasn't.
And how about you?
Well, what was the question? I kind of
What made you decide to go into the Air Force?
Well, my dad at one time had a general store in our town, and he took magazines and so forth. And I got interested in those old paperbacks, World War I.
oh yeah.
And I read account after account in those, and that's what appealed to me. And I wanted to, so I got my chance.
I remember when I was a youngster, there was a magazine called the Bill Barnes magazine, and then it became Air Trails. It was just about airplanes, and it had, remember that one? Had fictional stories that were serialized, and it came out once a month, and I just couldn't wait
Yeah.
at the end. I mean, my school, was homework aside, this was it. And I guess I was just fascinated by airplanes.
You remember the one G8 and his battle aces? That was I had to get that one every time it came out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Lothar, the big black that rode in the back of that plane of his.
You know, on a more philosophical level, you talk about war, and his story about the fellow who said he'd go back and fight for the fatherland. At the same time, you got to remember the Japanese on the west coast here. When Pearl Harbor came, suppose you lived in Redwood City, California, and you heard that they were lobbing shells into the Aleutian Islands. The greatest fleet base on the face of the earth had just been annihilated in the middle of the Pacific at Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese intended to come into the west coast, and they interned a bunch of them. I don't think they treated them badly, but they did intern them, and I can't find fault with that. At the same time, remember that there were thousands of Japanese Americans who joined the army and gave the most fantastic account of themselves in Italy.
Yeah.
And the battles at Anzio and that monastery, Montefiore, or wherever it was, and they were very distinguished fighters on behalf of the United
That was
States.
Monte Cassino, the
Monte
Abbey at Monte
Cassino,
Cassino, yeah.
So the philosophies,
We bombed that.
the Nazism, the Shintoism, these are not the people, it's the culture and the way they're trained. And maybe this country has to show the world how it works. There were terrible things that happened in the war. My Lord, they broke up the crews pretty much as you needed, and my gunner ended up flying with somebody else. I got sick for 2 months over there, very badly, of scrub typhus. It's like Rocky Mountain spotted fever. I damn near died. A lot of them did. And while I was out, they flew those missions over Balikpapan, which was the Ploesti of the Southwest Pacific. And my gunner, Larry Martin from Hingham, Massachusetts, was last seen bailing out over the harbor at Balikpapan. The airplane was hit and down. Everybody bailed out. The war was over, and a year after the war, I was sitting in my fraternity house at Lehigh University, and I got a letter from a friend of mine up in Boston with a little bit of a clipping. And it said, the bodies of 12 United States flyers unearthed at Selen Gap, north of Borneo. And it listed the pilot as a Philip McWeeny, who was flying that airplane that my gunner had been on. And it said the bodies had all been blindfolded and beheaded. And you know, you don't have to do that. That was done by militia, by the people on the ground, not the Air Force. So we have some pretty bad memories, and including some fun. Now, on this sheet that you asked me to look at, there's one thing. What were some of the good times? Okay, going to Sydney was one hell of a good time. And I can tell you, the Australian girls were very cordial, and the food was very, very good. And they treated us very, very well. They had psychological trauma, too. Remember, the great Australian manpower was deployed in the African, North Africa, and they were sitting alone, and the Japanese actually landed on the northern end of Australia, near Iron Range. And they treated us beautifully. We had a lot of fun. And the abject beauty of the South Pacific was in, those sunsets looking to the west against those high clouds. It was absolutely gorgeous, except there were no girls.
Gee, you had it rough, didn't you?
Yeah.
The girls that could speak
you
English.
guys, hey, listen, there's a universal language. You don't make a difference whether you can
Yeah,
speak
true,
language or
very
not.
true, very true. The trouble with the Italian girls, they all wanted to get married and have us bring them back home. No way.
It sounded like the bases were quite as bad as you started out saying. I'd like to thank you guys for coming in today and for what you did, during the war, and we have a lot of heartfelt thanks for the way our country is today for what you people did back then.
There's one thing I'd like to say to these kids here. I can't call them children because they're all pretty good size. But there's an awful lot of animosity today between religions, race, color.
Right.
Don't go along with it. I had 2 Jewish boys on my crew. Nicest guys you'd ever want to know. I don't know where they are today. They were They went down with my crew when the bomber went down. I'm afraid, being Jewish, I know what happened. We had a fighter group near us. They were black fellas. Believe me, they were eager, and we were damn glad to see them when they come up alongside, flying those P-47s. They were, well, they called them jugs, but those fellas were terrific.
They never lost a
No, sir.
bomber.
And by golly, when we could listen to them on the radio and you'd hear them, there'd be fighters off 3 o'clock. Hey, that one's mine. No, you got one yesterday. I'm going after him today. They would argue between themselves who was going to go after him, and then 2 or 3 would go. But don't ever let this business of a race or color get in, because after all, God made all of us.
You said it, man.
Important things to remember.
My faith in God is what pulled me through the
You
thing.
better believe it. There are no atheists and bombers or fighters, that's for sure.
Felt that there was probably some reason that I was spared, and I tried. I don't know how successfully, to make something useful of my life since. But it's nothing to aspire to, war, and I think maybe we found a way to beat it. But there are those, as I started to say half an hour ago, are those trying to revise history. As we all die off, there are people who say the Holocaust didn't exist. How ridiculous. You just want to read President Eisenhower's account of his entrance into Dachau. And, you know, if you haven't seen something yourself, and somebody says over and over and over again that this did happen or it didn't happen, why, you can become to have doubts. And that's the terrible part of what you're seeing now. So you've got to keep a clear head. Clear head.
I just hope you people never have to go through what we did back 50 years ago.
Yep.
You see it in the movies, they clean uniforms, everything, boy, great. Don't believe it. War is not creased shirts, creased pants, or eating steak every night either, like they do in the movies.
You mentioned one thing about the food. I forget what you called it. Buffalo?
Bully beef.
Bully beef. Ah, yes.
Regardless of what these guys tell you, they ate like kings compared to the crap we got in the South Pacific.
You had sea rations, I presume, dog food?
Only on the
Yeah,
airplane.
right.
The Australian bully beef on the land. If you could get the
The
can
English
open.
wasn't any better, believe
Get
me.
the can open.
You brought in your original uniform. Maybe if you could just hold that up and explain to
Oh,
folks.
this is my A2
it's
flight
in the-
jacket, which is not the original. The original doesn't fit me. I thought I was doing a
shrunk.
favor to my youngsters when I let them use it in high school. Thank you. And I got it back 3 years later, and it was during the 1960s when you were anti-everything. So they had torn off all the insignia. It looked like I'd been run over and skidded on by a Mack truck. And so I got another one out at Wright-Patterson Field last year because they're darn good jackets. But this is kind of humorous. This is my original jacket, which I pulled out of the barn day before yesterday, knowing I was coming here. And none of the stuff is polished. You'll have to forgive that. But this is it. And I'll hold it up there for you. And to show you that I haven't grown at all in the last few years, I'll put it on here. You see, it's a beautiful fit.
Now, how old were you when you went into the service?
The jacket shrunk, that's all. What do you want? The jacket shrunk a little.
Army cooking was good.
I was 20 years old when I went in.
Wow.
24, I guess, when I came out. And a little older in many ways.
Yeah, we all were.
Listen, I tell you, well, the Army does it right, though. Listen, that's 50 years old, and that piece of cloth is, it's really well made. All that stuff that is done for the Army is first class. But I got to tell you, you can be proud of one thing. You see nothing but dissension on the news, as we were saying before. But boy, and I'm sure you'll agree, that was a crisis and an emergency, and the way this country pulled together, like nothing I've ever seen before. Here we were, a civilian, peaceful country in 1938, and we were able to fight that war and train God knows how many thousand pilots to go out and fly airplanes. And I was telling Jim just beforehand, every airplane, every B-24 had a crew chief and 3 fellows that took care of it. And it came in either shot up or it is ground valves or trouble with the engine. And these fellows, way out there in the Pacific on an atoll with palm trees, would take an engine out of an airplane, make repairs, reinstall it, And they had been doing nothing maybe at a garage station 6 months before, but they were trained. And we were able to feel this force, this effective force to stop the horrors of the war. It was amazing.
It says a lot that we were able to turn our entire country
Exactly.
around just about overnight.
Yes,
And by the end of the war, have basically no military.
that's true.
To the largest military in the world.
Which makes the case sort of, the decommissioning of a number of the bases now. We know that, we're not going to fight it with huge numbers of people if we ever had to do it again. It's going to be done with in a technology that I can only dream about,
Yeah.
and that you could put together pretty quick. So you don't need to concentrate on the forces of war.
I remember the P-51 and P-47. They could make those, for a couple of $1,000s, and now what is it? F-14 goes for $40 million.
Yeah. Well, you try to buy a P-51 today.
Oh,
They're getting up there in price.
You're getting up there, all right.
P-51s, when we
200,000.
started over in the early part of 1943, our fighter cover was the old Bell P-39 Air Cobra, which was a marvelous piece of engineering, but as far as its ability to shoot down Japanese airplanes, it was nothing.
And the pilot couldn't get out.
Well, he could hardly get out. They were not shot down because they were just a piece of lead in the sky. You couldn't. They shot a 37 millimeter cannon right between the propeller, counter-rotating two props they had on the front, and the shaft went underneath the pilot, and the gun shot out front. And they could dive at immense speeds, but they couldn't maneuver. So having those things as cover was not a reassuring thing for us. But our technology advanced. When the war started, particularly in the Navy, the Japanese had a tremendous advantage of us. Their optics and technology was fantastic, and they could sit over the horizon and lob shells into American ships and hit them. But we reacted, and our technology 8 months later was better than theirs. And it was again, this country, when it has to, can really pull together.
Yeah, yeah. Once again, I want to thank you for coming in, and I myself, I'd love to continue the conversation, just talking about planes. But thank you for coming in and sharing it with our students. I'm Jim Bro from Linwood, and thanks for viewing.
never swing.